Hello, everyone. Welcome. My name is Ranji Khanna. For those of you who don't know me, I'm the director of the John Hope Franklin Humanities Institute, which is where you are currently, if you don't know that already. And I am very, very pleased today to say a little bit about the context in which our distinguished guest, Mary Louise Pratt, is here with us. Welcome. We have been running over the last year and a half now, a series of talks called under the rubric of the Entanglement Project. And this project addresses the historical, cultural, and political shifts in understanding entangled concepts of race, climate, and health that underpin any notion of, for example, a solution, or we might say a response even, to contemporary problems. We also look to innovations in learning to live and concepts of political futurity that emerge in literature, philosophy, and the arts. Lack of primary health care made increasingly visible by the COVID-19 pandemic, police violence, mass incarceration, extraordinary violence, genocide, for example, and the housing crisis created through evictions, repossessions, catastrophic climate events like Katrina, everyday ecological damage created by massive temperature shifts in previously forested areas and in Black neighborhoods where highways were created, like in Durham, the unequal beneficiaries of infrastructural change, lead-laden water, access to good education, the opportunities afforded by it are sites of injustice in which changes in the law, in medical system, and in climate-related policy could, of course, make a difference. But when we understand how the humanities might intervene into the conversations around this, we are asking, of course, somewhat different questions. To be sure, we're not against solutions, but certainly we ask for a measured response in all things, such that something like a solution is not final. So questions of what constitutes justice, health, or an ecology in which one can thrive, all of which are philosophical, imaginative, and historically and culturally shaped concepts debated within the humanities, are so often neglected when we're trying to think of things that are urgent or a crisis. We aim to shift that in this series of entangled projects. If we might state the obvious, there is no health without medical access, no justice without the law, no shelter without a healthy ecology. We might also say, very importantly, that the arts and the humanities are crucial in understanding the inadequacy of the correlation among those terms: justice, law, medicine, health, infrastructural change, thriving ecology, all need to be marked by an understanding of the incommensurabilities between those concepts. Today, we find ourselves once more at a moment that demands fundamental intellectual and institutional change. A moment marked by stark convergences of injustice and deprivation, amidst ongoing calls to decolonize the curriculum nationally and internationally, and the felling of statues all around the world at universities, museums, research institutions, including our own. We turn to this convergence of racial justice, health, climate, and ecology to rethink some of the most foundational questions posed by the arts and humanities. What makes a life worth living? How do we understand suffering, health, and wealth disparities, and the representation and the differential valuing of life, human or otherwise? How do shifts in technology shape modes of representation and life itself? What is the relationship between justice and the law? And how do we comprehend emergent, subhuman, global phenomena from particular local and national histories, from individual embodied experiences? Who defines our fields, and what is the racial, ecological, and medical history of our current forms of disciplinarity and interdisciplinarity. So as you see, we've got some pretty hefty questions going on at the moment here in FHI. I wanted to mark also that Michaeline Critchlow has been running the climate change, decolonization, and global blackness strand of the Entanglement Project. And Michael Cavuto here has been assisting her, partnering in that venture. If you are interested in learning more about the strand in particular, please do go and look at the really wonderful short essay, really, description that that is up on our website. And if you are interested in participating in any of the events, just show up or contact Michael for more information. And with that, I'm going to hand over to my colleague Esther Guevara to introduce Mary Louise Pratt. Thanks for coming, everyone.
Hi, it's lovely to see everybody here. This is a real honor for me. So I'll be very brief because you all are here to hear Mary speak. One could introduce Mary Louise Pratt by a list of professional achievements. As Silver Professor at NYU, with major grants received from the American Council of Learned Societies, the Pew Foundation, and the NEH, a Guggenheim, of course. One could introduce her through a description of her groundbreaking publications, beginning with Tortoise Speech Act Theory of Literary Discourse from 1977, which I would recommend for any students of performance studies present. Obviously, Imperial Eyes in its 2 editions, 1992 and 2008. Google claims it has been cited over 22,000 times. Its perhaps most impactful concept of the contact zone even today provides the title, I'm wondering if Mary knows this, of the 2023 edition of the Immigrant Artists Biennial in New York. Yeah, it's up now. You can go see it. They take the contact zones and they cite your book. For that, it looks quite fascinating. Los Imaginarios Planetarios, 2017, which preceded Planetary Longings to 2022. Not to mention edited collections that open a view onto long-standing and important collaborations, Women, Culture, and Politics in Latin America, co-authored with the Seminar on Feminism and Culture in Latin America, a group of leading women thinkers from Stanford and Berkeley, and Critical Passions, collected essays of Jean Franco, edited with Kathleen Newman on their dissertation advisor's field-making work. One could introduce her as a dedicated pedagogue and mentor. She has directed, it seems, 27 dissertations, and the vast majority of her students are now tenured or tenure-track scholars of note, even as several have thrived in other fields, such as filmmaking and others. A significant majority of scholars on that list are women, notable especially in the early 1990s. One could introduce her as a savvy and tireless political advocate for multilingualism and for the humanities as president of the MLA. That advocacy for multilingual humanities is still needed in the face of attacks, not just from outside, but also inside our own universities. But all of that information is available with the resources at your disposal, and Michaeline and Michael asked me to introduce Mary from my experience as her former student. So my introduction instead will be a hint for listening based on some of what I learned from studying with her many years ago. Here's the hint. Pay attention to how Mary diagnoses with X-ray-like vision what is at stake in the scholarly projects to which we dedicate our time and labor. She always asks, what's the project here? The big project composed of the political stakes, the ideological prejuicios, the people included or excluded, often women, scholars of color, intellectuals from the global South, the framing, whether historical or conceptual, such that the outcome is as we receive it in the book, article, or lecture. In her own writing, that analytic comes with a decision about words because, and here I'm going to rephrase her attitude toward language into my words, we scholars are craftsmen too, makers of texts, and our primary tool is language. So in each of her texts, from short articles to major books, a core vocabulary is selected and defined that guides our path through what is at stake in her project: the tellable speech act, the contact zone, the planetary, the concept. Like a needle embroidering cloth, these words draw out the concept image of the study. And she makes it seem easy, crisp, and clear. Here's an example from a 9-page essay I always teach. Those of you who've been in my seminars know I always teach this. I see you smiling. Modernity and Periphery from 2002. She writes, quote, I have found it quite useful to think of modernity as an identity discourse, as Europe's or the white world's identity discourse as it assumed global dominance. The centrism of modernity is in part ethnocentrism, though it does not readily identify itself in this manner. It seems easy when you say it like that. Modernity equals identity discourse equals ethnocentric, but it's not. I mean, the clarity is something I still return to. In an essay in Debate Feminista published long before everyone was decolonizing everything, one of my favorite passages. Can I read it in Spanish? Is that okay? Okay. El feminismo, el tercermundismo antiimperial, el latinoamericanismo de izquierda, la lucha antirracista, nutrieron también en mí un obstinado e implacable antagonismo hacia el eurocentrismo. Sigo incrédula de que, a pesar del esfuerzo masivo mundial de las últimas 5 décadas, no se descoloniza la producción de saberes y el dominio europeo sobre las ideas humanas sigue reproduciéndose en nuestras universidades. La experiencia occidental, blanca, urbana, burguesa, opera como norma implícita en las teorizaciones, las propuestas culturales y hasta en las ciencias. Los conceptos se legitiman pasando por la metrópolis. Los cursos de teoría son cátedras de occidentalismo. Este provincialismo, esa falta de curiosidad, me enfurece y me desespera. Note how she names problems as they are. Eurocentrism is provincialism. Latin American feminism is the battle against ignorant misogyny. Theory with a capital T is training in Eurocentrism, and she's honest with us that she's really angry about it. That is the project, the diagnosis, the honesty, and the anger. So one final example that I'll close this introduction with, and that I think will be relevant to what she's talking about today, about the planetary longings at the heart of her new book, is very short. El gran reto que enfrentan los humanistas es dejar de serlo. The great challenge that humanists face is to stop being or being one. The human can no longer orient the humanities. There must be a break in the word, a line through it, an about face that attends to ecological crises and non-human persons. We may also have to stop being in that future foretold by today's planetary ecological disaster. That is not dystopia, but a different way of living. And she writes about the concept of buen vivir. Reflecting on a performance by Cree artist Thompson Highway, which I was lucky enough to be present at also, the project is, she writes in Planetary Longings, the matter of how to live the loss, and perhaps how to live loss beyond losing becomes a central social, moral, imaginative, physical, and aesthetic challenge. Developing new arts of the living, clear-eyed in what remains of the garden, while retaining the capacity for beauty and joy, is going to call for the powers of the cosmic clown, the trickster goddess who drums, dances, and laughs. These two Canadian tricksters then, Thompson Highway and Mary Louise Pratt, turned things upside down. In that performance, I remember Highway kept promising that once we go north, the true north, his north, not a global north, we will understand. He would say, wait till you get up there, you'll see. You're about to find out. You will be changed. White people will turn black and black turn white. So prepare to be norteados, turned around, disoriented, changed by the project at hand, and as she suggests, to enjoy the journey.
Yes, thank you. I love that we have a train. That's kind of cool. So I'm very aware, having, after so many years in doing this kind of work, that when you go somewhere, you put your ideas in a suitcase and get on a plane and travel somewhere, you never know how those ideas are going to travel with you and how they're going to be perceived when you land. And so I am very aware of that and very curious to see, but also prepared for surprises in your responses to what I have to say today, and also how it fits into the larger picture here. So my framework today is the same, is where planetary longings takes off from. It's my framework here is what I call the millennial pivot, el giro milenario. The millennial pivot, meaning the sense that with the turn of the millennium in 2000, we entered humankind entered a new phase in both its human and planetary condition. And it's been marked in our language by the pivot from the global to the planetary. The global, of course, was the word global, globality, globalization was the word that belonged to neoliberalism, neoliberal capitalism, and its tremendous expansion over the 80s and 90s, so that it became a kind of globally, the world became a kind of global architecture of designed by extractive capitalism, and there was no space or being anymore that could be imagined as outside of that. Everything was in it in one way or another. And planetarity, of course, is the pivot to facing a crisis of futurity, facing ecological disaster, environmental crisis, rapid and unpredictable change, the destabilization of the conditions of life for everything that exists. And in particular, the future, the fact that humans have created the conditions for their own demise and for the end of basically carbon-based life of all kinds. So that's what I mean by a crisis of futurity. In academic discourse, this pivot or this shift is marked by, as I said, shift from global to planetary, and also by a shift from the post to the geo. So in the 90s, the 90s were the age of the post, right? And we were in postmodernism and post-colonialism and post-humanism and post-everything. And it was interesting that kind of, I want to say, epidemic of post, because it presupposed, and this is my main topic today is the conditions of knowledge production and the crisis of knowledge production that these shifts are producing for us, and what kinds of opportunities those bring us. The post kind of assumed a knowing subject that had their back to the future and was looking out at the past and seeing these large narratives that were being lived and had exhausted themselves, and were now available then as objects of study and object of contemplation. And that was the kind of posture of the knowledge producing subject. And of course, with the pivot, we now are facing the future, and we're facing not just and the geo. And by geo, I mean the post existed in historic time, the time that existed, there was historical time. With the pivot towards planetarity, we pivot into geological time, the Anthropocene, and that's planetary level time, right? And we also pivot into Earth, meaning we now talk about geohumanities and geolinguistics, and the geo meaning also referring to the planet as a celestial thing. This also involves a crisis of agency. Spivak in Death of Discipline says at one point, she introduces 2003, the concept of planetarity. And she says at a certain point, we have to change from being global agents to planetary subjects. And there's there a kind of decentering of the human and a sense of a decentering of human agency from being global agents, the world makers, to planetary subjects, meaning the people who are going to live a process. And I thought that was very a very telling kind of shift in vocabulary, because now indeed the planetary subject sees itself surrounded by changes, events, and processes that humans have put in motion, have set in motion, but which they no longer control at all, right? So the idea of humans as architects of the planet, of the globe, seems now like hubris, which it is. The post also marks a lacuna, a conceptual lacuna, because if you're in the post, you can name the narratives and look at the narratives you're not living, but you aren't naming the one you are living. And we're still in that way in the post when we talk about post-human. We don't know yet what the name is or the plot is of whatever narrative, whatever grand narrative we're now living. And that's, of course, a big part of our crisis of futurity. For many of you, you probably, if you weren't a kind of a sentient being in the 1990s, you won't know that planetary was not a common term in the 80s and 90s, as I said, we were in the global and in particular. And there are a couple of markers of how the pivot into planetarity that have stood out to me as I've kind of watched around. Where does this term come in? And one of the first appearances of the planetary was a comic series, actually, that appeared in it started up in 1999 in LA. It was called Planetarity, and it dealt with a set of celestial superheroes who lived in a cosmos called the Wildstorm universe, and they called themselves archaeologists of the future. And when I read about that comic series, I thought, wow, how prescient it kind of was. Archaeologists of the future is like the the subject of the imagined future subject of the Anthropocene, who looks back at the way the detritus left by humanities in this process of destroying itself. The crisis of futurity, I think, was symbolized and almost like inaugurated ritually by the Y2K crisis. And I don't know if any of you remember Y2K, but there was those of us who were sentient beings in the 90s remember that there was a tremendous, genuine apprehension worldwide that at midnight on December 31st, 1999, all the computers in the world were going to start smoking and fall and melt down because they didn't know how to start dating into a new millennium. And there was real genuine uncertainty that all of you who remember that moment will remember, that nobody knew. And people worked for years in the 90s trying to fix that, to anticipate and make it, but no one knew if the fixes were going to work. And so there was this sense of, indeed, radical uncertainty. And it was like, that was the millennium just setting the tone for the whole project. So inevitably, this crisis of futurity is also a crisis of knowledge and of knowledge making and of practices of knowledge making. So, and it's a moment, we all know we're living a moment of anguish and rage and fear and grief and infinite frustration and uncertainty. And I think what I want to get across today is too, we're also living a very dynamic moment. Where the world is very alive. And it's a moment that we can, and maybe we should live with passion and with curiosity and with enthusiasm and with daring and with urgency and with seriousness, but also with creativity and joy. It's a moment for taking risks and learning from failures. What's to lose, and less to lose, right? And learn from failures. It's a very bad moment for many things, but it seems like a very rich moment to be thinking and creating. And I kind of want to hold on to that framing. Science, of course, has lost its constitutive criteria. It's a gold standard, right, of predictability and replicability. And this is just a fascinating moment. The laws of nature, it's the mandate to discover the laws of nature has kind of dissolved. And earthbound sciences are operating now in a context of uncertainty and unpredictability because the phenomena they're studying are changing every day. And so the experiment of yesterday is no longer replicable tomorrow. And that's the one thing you can be pretty certain of, that it's probably not replicable. So that replicability as the norm for valid knowledge, scientific knowledge production is has to be replaced by some other set of criteria and expectations. Systemic analysis, systems fail because the systemic analysis fails because the systems are mutating in ways that are both too fast and also impossible to anticipate. Current data will no longer predict the future. And that's the one thing you can be certain of, is that it won't work, or it probably won't work. Same with statistics. You can now know that whatever your climate statistics are, they will not be the same in the future. They will not, because statistics are just the projection of the past onto the future, right? So statistics can no longer guide us. So we saw that, and we all saw that crisis of scientific knowledge with COVID, which COVID felt like kind of the planet running an experiment on itself. So we kept telling ourselves with COVID that we need to trust the science, and the state kept telling us trust science, and the science kept trying to be right and not being right, and then not knowing what to do about being wrong and trying to adjust. And it was a really that impact on science was, and that revelation about science, I think, was a really major impact and inheritance from that we received from COVID. So it raises the question: what does science become in the context of this level of unpredictability? When the thing that's most predictable is that things will remain unpredictable. What can we ask of science then? So this is what I mean by a crisis in knowledge production. And in the humanities, or the human sciences, I think the humanities are required to redefine their object of study and question their founding task. The founding task of analyzing the human in a kind of sui generis way, apart from all the other entities with which humanity is entangled and with which it shares the planet, all the other entities that have made humanity what it is. And it's studying the human in a sui generis way, apart from all those things, and also over all those things. That is, that the humanities attribute to the human a greater value than other things. And that is kind of implicit in humanism and in its mandate. And it's built into the human nature dichotomy. And the planetary turn brings a recognition that sui generis privileging of the human has made the humanities complicit in the unfolding of capitalist extractivism and colonial extractive regimes. And those are the regimes that have ironically then created the conditions for humanity's demise. So in fact, the very concept of nature now appears to us as the frame in which extractivism defines its field of operations. and imagines its future. So, as many critics have pointed out, and though I always cite Amitav Ghosh in The Great Derangement, this kind of autonomous self-absorption of Occidental humanism, this anthropocentrism, produces human subjects that are fundamentally deluded about their place in the world. Right? And this is Ghosh's critique in The Great Derangement. We are deranged by our own education, incapacitated in the Western subjects by their own educations, we're deprived of the capacity to conceive of ourselves as subjects are deprived of the capacity to conceive of themselves as entangled in and dependent upon all the coexisting entities with which they share the planet. The humanities are devoted often to developing humans' ability to reflect on themselves, the human capacity for self-reflection. That is one of the gold standards of humanistic work. And that's not a bad thing at all. But I think it's really valuable to recognize that capacity for self-reflection did not have to be trained in the way that it has been, right? It doesn't have to have taken this particular form. It could have been a relational form of self-reflection, for example, that we now know we need to develop. And now with the planetary pivot, I think as work like the work we're doing here, we can identify some of the forms of blindness that the human nature dichotomy has created and established, and move beyond them. And all kinds of artistic practices and literary practice and scholarly practices are doing that kind of work now in things like the environmental humanities or the studies here. People now, we know how to think now to parse the sentence, you are not in the environment, you are the environment. So, so if the scientists are called upon to redefine their objectives, their expectations, their criteria of value, their management of unpredictability and uncertainty as methodological principles now, the humanities are called upon to redefine their object of study and reconceptualize their object of study. And at the lexical level, we've been registering that imperative with terminological contortions like post-humanistic humanities or posthuman humanities, and again, that's the place where we fall into the post, because we don't yet have the name for where we're going, right? We only can mark the concept that has now become our object of study and our object of scrutiny and our object of questioning. So we still don't have the plot for the new future into which we are protecting ourselves. And we have this term, the Anthropocene, but the Anthropocene doesn't give us a story, right? Our story. Of course, there are people all over the planet who have not been formed by Western humanism, including many people in the West. In 1996, a brilliant book appeared called The End of Capitalism as We Knew It by two feminist political economists who wrote together under the name J.K. Gibson Graham. And they showed in that book that capitalist regimes are and have always been full of non-capitalist modes of production. And capitalism has only ever worked because of that. Similarly, I think people instilled with Western humanism also carry other kinds of knowledge and knowing that their experiences have given them, and that contradict the extractive human nature dichotomy, and those have been essential to people's survival and well-being in capitalism. it's become clear that recognizing and valuing and growing these ways of knowing, these ways of experiencing and imagining are crucial to figuring out how to live the eco-catastrophe that's unfolding around us. And this is true whether you're an optimist or a pessimist or an agnostic about the outcome. We're still faced with the problem of how to live it. And of course, that's where decolonization comes in. Because decolonization, I think, is the other planetary or another planetary world-changing force that the Millennial Pivot brought into play in a new way. In 1999, Spivak's critique of post-colonial reason appeared, kind of marking the end of the post-colonial preoccupation. And that same year, Linda Tuhiwai Smith's Decolonizing Methodologies appeared, and Taiyaki Alfred's Peace, Power, and Righteousness, an Indigenous Manifesto, and Walter Mignolo's Local Histories, Global Designs, Coloniality, Subaltern Knowledges, and Border Thinking. And you could add many more examples. 1999 was a year when a whole bunch of very ground-changing books appeared. And I think that suggests that the Millennial Pivot was marked a knowledge revolution that was entering a new phase. And I've been thinking about this mostly from the point of view of indigeneity, especially in the Americas. So that's how I'll talk about it for the rest of my time here. But I think what the things one says about indigeneity and indigenous knowledge production extend a lot, or have a lot in common, overlap a lot with what happens in the Black diaspora as well, the African diaspora as well. In the 1980s and 90s, because of the expansion, the huge expansion of extractive industry and multinationals over the planet, indigenous peoples were mobilized in new ways politically. And processes of indigenization also were embarked on in many parts of the world that became where groups had their habitats threatened by external forces of capitalism. And so all kinds of friction happen, and I'm referring there to Anna Tsing's book, Friction. So in my term for this is that during the 80s and 90s, indigeneity globalized itself. It became an issue at the United Nations, and the United Nations started working on a Declaration of Indigenous Rights, for example. They named a global rapporteur on indigenous issues in the 90s. So indigeneity really, and as I say, globalized itself in the 90s, became a global presence. And in Spanish America, this process was catalyzed a lot by the quincentennial of Columbus, the 1992 quincentennial. Many people in Latin America with the promotion of Spain's new promotion of the glory of its empire became much more aware than they had been of the coloniality of their realities, and began to push back. And there was a huge in 1992. There was the first hemisphere South American gathering of indigenous peoples happened in Quito, Ecuador, and produced a declaration called the Declaración de Quito. And that was marked a huge shift in indigenous politics in Latin America, that collective happened. And of course, in 1994, the Zapatistas made all their declarations, not only from Chiapas, but they were addressing the entire world and invited the entire world to join in their work. They reached out in a completely global way. So, and in many countries in Latin America, but also elsewhere in the world, in many countries, there was a political and legal empowerment of populations within nation states, as well as within international bodies of indigenous populations. So indigeneity became in the 80s and 90s a geopolitical force. And in the 21st century, it has become an intellectual force. There has been a huge flourishing of indigenous knowledge making all over the planet, indigenous thought, philosophical speculation, social theorizing, engaged knowledge. And one of the markers, one of the distinctive features of this phase of indigenous knowledge making is that it is extroverted, right? It is reaching out. Indigenous thinkers and knowledge makers are addressing everyone. They're not, this is not about, I want to tell you how we feel, how we think. You need to know. It's, we have the knowledge that everybody needs to get us where we need to be going, right? So that extroverted, that proliferation of indigenous knowledge making and its extroverted character are, I think, really distinctive and very important shifts in the knowledge making landscape. And I imagine indigenous knowledge making kind of moving into the space being vacated by the exhausted man-nature dichotomy that we are now looking back on. And you really are getting what I think is, I've called in other places, the work of remaking an intellectual commons. And with a sense that, again, that indigenous knowledge is strategic knowledge, is the kind of knowledge that is needed in order to carry every humanity forward and all life forms forward. And so it's really directly addressing this knowledge making, the imperative in the name of both environmentalism and social justice for all. And the base is from knowledge. The goal is knowledges that are not created, have not been created to sustain extractivism, but rather have been created to replace it or resist it. And you get a lot, and in this knowledge production, you get a lot of interesting experiments in form, in writing form, in use of language, in expression, in ritualized knowledge making. We've also seen some really interesting and incredible experiments and achievements in coming out of long-term collaborations between indigenous and non-indigenous knowledge makers, like Marisol de la Cadena's book, Earth Beings, and David Copenau and Bruce Albert's book, The Falling Sky. These are projects that Arturo Escobar designs for the Pluriverse. These are knowledge-making projects that they kind of reverse the usual role of ethnography, in the sense that the classic ethnographer familiarized themselves with the native person's world and then wrote an ethnography explaining that world to a reader. These books tell the reader, show the reader how to come into the world of the other, right? The unknown world. They work in a different direction. And I think it's interesting to contrast this contemporary indigenous knowledge making that I'm talking about with an earlier phase of indigenous knowledge making, which was the period of the testimonio in the 1980s and 90s, particularly the 90s, in which ex-colonial subjects, often indigenous or African descended ex-colonial subjects would tell their story, right, to a metropolitan intellectual, who would then tape their story, their words, and edit it into a personal narrative that could be consumed by a metropolitan public, right? And this was, and of course, the classic in this was Rigoberta Menchú's famous Testimonio. And there, it's such an interesting comparison of that earlier phase of what was essentially an effort. It was a decolonizing effort, and it had a very big impact. Testimonio brought, but it was all about voice, right? It brought the untold stories and unheard voices into the intellectual commons and created the possibilities of engagement that were not there before. So its energy was a decolonizing energy, but, and it created a new form of writing, right? But you can see now, looking back from the present, how much that form nevertheless retained its coloniality, the coloniality of the relationship between the person giving the testimonio and the editor figure who converted it into something literate, right? Both the mode of production, the way that happened, and then the way that what was imposed on the person's words was a conversion into being a narrative of the personal, and recreating the figure of the personal there. And when the challenge, those of you who are participating in this, in Latin American studies in this period, you'll remember that when the challenge of testimonio, of the authority of the testimonio, became too threatening, academic intellectuals turned on it, just turned on the form. And this culminated, of course, in David Stoll's book, another book from 1999, in which he just tried to completely take apart Roberta Menchu's, and spent 2 years working on doing that, taking apart her testimonio in his book, Rigoberta Menchú and the Poor People of Guatemala, right? But even people who had supported the testimonio and participated in its dissemination, when their own intellectual authority was felt to be at risk, defended it, right? So that in testimonio is basically gone away. But the decolonizing work has continued, and here we are today. In this century, I think a new phase of decolonizing knowledge making was one of the key things that set it in motion or has animated it, is the concept of the coloniality of power, right? And the idea that we are not post-colonial at all, and that colonial structures, assumptions, and hierarchies continue to operate long after colonial structures are gone, that colonial relations of power have an enormous ability to mutate and reappear and refashion themselves, so that very often what looks like an acts of decolonization turn out to be acts of recolonization. And that, so that idea, that concept of coloniality, which we owe to Aníbal Quijano and to Walter for disseminating it here, and the idea of the ability to mutate and recolonize, coming from Silvia Rivera Cusicanqui. I think there's something really, I think of this partly just because I'm a lexical fiend, as the shift from the ISM suffix colonialism to coloniality. And I love that shift because I think what's incredibly generative about coloniality and the ITY in general is that it lets you think of coloniality, of the colonial, as a force, okay? Not a, coloniality to me does not speak of a condition or a characteristic of something, or a way of being. I see it as a force that is at large in the world. It has the ability, a force that has the ability to make things happen wherever it is at present, at any scale and in any register, right? But you can't ever predict what necessarily it's going to do. But it has a force with the capacity to make things happen in any setting in which it is present. So indigeneity can take the form, coloniality can take the form of a leopard pattern on a blouse, or a camera angle in a film, or a global tourist industry, or an agency of the United Nations, or the sale of a sale of a nation's water rights to a multinational, as happened in Bolivia, and everything in between. These are forces that can operate at any scale and in almost any register and make things happen, but you can't always know what they're going to do and what they're going to make happen. So, and I feel like this concept, I have found this concept of force to be very productive and generative in thinking in our present, in our planetary moment, because precisely, well, for several reasons, which I'll get to in a minute, but I find it helpful to conceptualize indigeneity and decolonization in the same way as forces that are at large in the world that can make things happen wherever they're in play at almost any medium and any scale. So indigeneity too can act as as a piece of clothing, the constitution of a country, an academic program, a UN declaration, an artistic expression, you name it, right? Now, I think there are several reasons why this concept of force is very enabling for us now. And one of them is the one I've mentioned, that it enables us to navigate scale very easily. In other words, we are not required to think either big or little, right? And it doesn't see scale as a linear thing where you move from local to global or little to big. Everything is on everything. You have to be able to think of everything at multiple scales all the time. We learned this with the virus, with the pandemic. You had to be able to think about COVID-19 as a piece of DNA that's looking for hosts, right? And also as this planetary catastrophe that's on a scale that involves literally every human on the planet. And that you had to be able to hold that scale, that range of scales in your mind, in your imagination, in order to grasp. And I think that kind of challenge of scale and that derangement of hierarchies of scale is a huge part of the shift in consciousness that we're having to experience with Planetarity. And so I love that force hasn't got a problem with scale and with the disordering of scale. And it doesn't have a problem with predictability either. Thinking about forces operating the world doesn't require you to be able to think where they're taking you, what will happen next. And, you know, many people live in the world this way all the time, right? And so you imagine yourself kind of in a force field all the time. And you're very aware of the forces that are around you with which you are interacting and that are interacting with you. And the other thing that I like about force is that it enables you to think in the same terms about human and non-human actors. You can think of coloniality as a force or decolonization as a force, and you can think of water as a force. And in fact, you have to think of water as a force right now. And water is a force that can make a ring on a tabletop, or it can decimate a whole city, right? Or it can put a continent underwater. So to me, it's very helpful to be able to think about human and non-human agents, to find vocabulary. We have to find vocabularies that enable us to think about human and non-human and even non-animate agents, right, at the same time, and as the things with which we are entangled. And I think the idea of force is really helpful that way. And I found myself thinking alongside that my old concept of contact zone of us learning to imagine things as force fields and training our imaginations in that way. I wanted to, yes, wait, what am I doing here before yeah, so I think the idea of force is really key to breaking out of the humanist mindset and become aware of the agency and power of these other things. And I wanted to just give an example of that. There's a lot of, of course, there's a lot of, again, very original inventive scholarship around us that is addressing this problem of agency and how to grasp the agency of non-humans and how to imagine ourselves in a world animated by all kinds of forms of all kinds of agents. It started a whole thread started with trees, right? The secret life of trees, the hidden life of trees, looking for the mother tree. There's a huge kind of tour de force book by Elaine Dewar called Smarts that goes through the literatures on all the forms of intelligence, all the forms intelligence takes in all kinds of entities, animate and not. And I've been particularly impacted by a recent book that came out recently by Jean Vaillant, but they call him Valiant, called Fire Weather, that is about fire, the force of fire. And it's a book that surveys both the history and the chemistry of fire. But he does so in the context of retelling the story, putting together the story of the huge fire in the Canadian North in 2016 that destroyed the city of Fort McMurray. Fort McMurray is a city of 90,000 people that exists way in on the border of Alberta and the Northwest Territories, and it exists because it staffs the oil patch there, the extraction, the oil sands industry, which is extracts oil from sand in the most dirty, energy conserving process that exists in the world. The Alberta oil sands have produced tremendous benefits to the Canadian economy. The oil is extracted and shipped to the United States for refining. And in the summer of 2016, Fort McMurray was destroyed by a forest fire that was one of the new kinds of fires that burns faster and hotter, not only than any fire ever did, than anyone ever imagined a fire could. And this is the story of that fire, how the city was destroyed, how all the experts, everything they knew about fires, we know how to control forest fires. We've been doing it for decades, for centuries. We have all this equipment. We know everything they knew about fires made them completely disabled them from being able to handle this fire. They were wrong about everything all the time. And part of the story is the radical shift that had to take place in the minds of the firefighter expertise, the people assigned to fight the fire, who had to start imagining the fire as an entity with agency and intentionality of its own, almost a will of its own. And they're in the position of just trying to figure out trying to respond to whatever it does next. And this whole gathering these stories and reading the whole literature on fire, starting with Ovid's Metamorphosis, it leads him to ask the question, is fire alive? And let me tell you what he says on that question in the book. He says, is fire alive? After all, it meets many of the criteria. Fire is animate in the sense that it requires oxygen, right? It breathes, and it behaves. It can be propagated by others of its kind. It can generate offspring. It grows, it breathes, it travels in search of nourishment. It persists with the opportunism and single-mindedness of all successful life forms. It persists with the single-mindedness of all successful life forms, including us. It can lie dormant for long periods, awaiting more favorable conditions. It can adapt to changing conditions. It can die of starvation and suffocation. The only two ways to kill fire: suffocate them and starve them. It can be killed. It can be revived, and it can turn on its master, who might not be its master at all. Elsewhere in the book, he says, it is fire's nature to strive upward. In other words, to aspire. Remember, aspire is connected to breathing, right? Which means literally to breathe desire into and also to rise. Fire, it can be said, is aspiration in its purest form. Desire burning and burning desire. To exist, to consume, to grow, to flourish, all as fervently as we do. Fire does not have consciousness, but it does have character. And there are internal and external factors that motivate, guide, deter, and defeat it. One of those factors is that there is no other natural force or element over which we have such a compelling illusion of control. Finally, fire may not be alive or conscious in the sense that we are, and yet its behavior manifests a vitality, flexibility, and ambition often associated with intelligent animals. Likewise, we may not appear as flickering sprites composed of light and smoke, and yet distilled to our core, to our essence, we are fire's kin. We are gas-driven, fuel-burning, heat-generating appetites who will burn as bright and hot as we can, stopping at nothing until we're fully extinguished. So he's creating reading fire as animate and animate beings as fire. And in the end, of course, he connects fire to extractive capitalism and says capitalism is not only like fire, it is fire. It is combustion, right? That's the carbon kind of capitalism argument. And so that leaves us with a really interesting question. How do you decolonize combustion, right? And is it, and is combustion decolonizing itself to some degree by wiping out Fort McMurray? So my point really here is that the planetary subject is one that sees itself always as a force in a force field, or that's the way I'm imagining it, and one of the things that I'm saying about it. And I think about, this brought me back to Bourdieu and his idea that about agency, right? That everything that exists is always making its habitat, its conditions of existence. The world is entirely made. Everything happens because everything else happened. And I think that's a really kind of helpful vision for us. I just want to return now at the end to the question of indigeneity as both environmental force and a decolonizing force. The indigenous, and what I just want to add a few details to that conversation. I think that the indigenous peoples who exist now, who continue to exist in the world as indigenous peoples, that indigeneity is energized from two sources, which I call ancestrality and resistance, right? And it's the existence, the coexistence and the interaction of those two forces, I think is a huge aspect of the force that indigeneity has in the world and what it gives to the world. So ancestrality, of course, is that which is passed down from the pre-indigenous time, right? Nobody's indigenous till somebody else shows up, right? So the ancestrality is that which there is a line of continuity with the past. If that line is lost completely, it becomes hard to hold on to indigeneity, right? So ancestrality is an important, and many, of course, most of the indigenous people who have existed in the world no longer exist as peoples, right? In fact, the formula, the mechanism has not worked for them. So ancestrality is that which is passed down, form of knowledge, right? Resistance is that which is enabled survival, and even flourishing under difficult, under colonial conditions or imperial conditions. And that too is a knowledge base. It's a knowledge base. So as Thomson Highway likes to say, you need to listen to us. We are the masters of extinction. You know, people have been trying to drive us into extinction for 200 years, and we know how to live that. So these two forms of knowledge and forms are also the forces that energize indigeneity. And nowhere has that combination been more potent than in Bolivia in the last 40 years. And it has transformed Bolivian society and in the Bolivian state. Knowledge making has been just absolutely central to that. I really recommend a book if you want to know more about this, in particular, the extraordinary Bolivian case by Ben Dangle, D-A-N-G-L, called The 500-Year Rebellion. In English it is. So, and the idea that these forms of knowledge from ancestrality and resistance are the kinds of knowledge that everybody needs now is kind of the underpinning of what has happened in Bolivia. So very quickly, in Bolivia went through, and there are people here who know far more about this than I do, but Bolivia since the 1970s has underwent a really radical or decolonization of knowledge and institutions. And this involved in particular a huge revitalization of the Aymara majorities, history, their knowledge base, their governance, their theories of social relations, their values, their political thought, and the incorporation of these into the culture of the whole country, right? They acquired authority for everyone. And one of the key dynamics that made this possible was the arrival in the universities in the 1980s of rural Aymara students at the University of San Andres, in particular in La Paz. And these students arrived and found that they were learning Marxist thought, Marxist revolutionary thought, and it was like looking in a mirror and seeing nothing. They said, we don't see ourselves in this picture. And this thought, Marxist thought, is critical of capitalism. Of course, it's anti-capitalism, but it doesn't offer indigenous peoples any positive role in constructing a different world. So they were encouraged by some of their faculty to create that knowledge base. And they did. They started going back to their communities. You had to be bilingual. You had to know Aymara to be able to do this work, and they did. And they started producing a kind of decolonized Aymara knowledge base. And the way Dangle puts it in his book, he said they saw themselves not as survivors of colonialism clinging to traditions, to past. They saw themselves as inheritors of a colonial situation, which they had the power to transform. And that the knowledge they had had the capacity to produce more just nations. And I just want to, I know we're out of time. In fact, I have no idea what time it is, so I shouldn't say that. But this resulted in, of course, as many of you know, the overthrow of the the white oligarchy that had ruled Bolivia for a very long time. Eventually, it took till 2004, and the creation of a new constitution for Bolivia, and of course a tremendous political struggle. But within that process also, as I've said before, a huge intellectual flourishing of social thought and all kinds of experiments in knowledge making and in intellectual work. And I just want to read you quickly then the preamble of the new Bolivian Constitution of 2009, which was created by a constitutional assembly that worked on it for 4 years. And it was an assembly that had involved people from all was half indigenous, I believe. It was a representative of the whole of Bolivian society. And you'll see here, of course, the kind of ecological knowledge base that is at work here. In ancient times, mountains arose and rivers moved and lakes were formed. Our Amazonia, our swamps, our highlands, and our plains and valleys were covered with greenery and flowers. We populated this sacred Mother Earth with different faces, and since that time, we have understood the plurality that exists in all things and in our diversity as human beings and cultures. This, our peoples are formed, and we never knew racism until we were subjected to it during the terrible times of colonialism. We, the Bolivian people of plural composition, from the depths of history, inspired by the struggles of the past, by the anti-colonial indigenous uprising, and in independence by the popular struggles of liberation, by the water and the October Wars, by the struggles for land, etc., construct a new state in memory of our martyrs, a state based on respect and equality for all, on principles of sovereignty, dignity, interdependence, solidarity, harmony, and equity in the distribution and redistribution of the social wealth, where the search for a good life, and that's the phrase buen vivir, which has become a key phrase in indigenous thought in Latin America. We take on the historic challenge of collectively constructing a unified social state of plurinational communitarian law. We found Bolivia anew, refounding the state anew, fulfilling the mandate of our people with the strength of our Pachamama and the gratefulness to God. And the fundamental principles on which this new state, refounded state, is going to be based include, the first article is, the state adopts and promotes the following ethical moral principles of the plural society. And these words are all in Aymara, right? Amaquilla, Amaluya, Amasuwa, Suma Kumanya, Nandereko, Tekokavi, Marai, I don't even know how to pronounce that one, Kanak. And these are all translation mean, do not be lazy, do not be a liar or thief, live well, live harmoniously, live a good life, land without evil, noble, and live in a noble path. And then the second article says the state is based on values of unity, equality, and so on. So the new language that is worked out here is, I mean, the project has gone through many, many ups and downs, but the language there is really very powerful. And I think it is kind of taking us in the direction that we are going to need to go. Now, the last thing I want to say is that one of the articles in the new constitution in Bolivia includes a list of all the things that Bolivian people, children, should be able to learn in the course of becoming Bolivian citizens. And one of the things that the state is obliged to teach people is how to dance, dance. And if you've been in the Andes, you know that dance is a huge, huge part of life, everyday life and ritual life and political life and every kind of life. And I think, and dance as one of the forms of knowledge that people are required to acquire brings me back to my culture hero, Thompson Highway, who Esther introduced you to, who sees dance, song, laughter as the critical elements that we are going to require in order to live whatever the futures are that we are facing. They are the things, he says, that make life worth living. He wrote 2 books in 1922, published 2 books. One is called Laughing with the Trickster, and the other is called Permanent Astonishment. And laughter and permanent astonishment at the beauty of the world are both powers that he says, if we don't have those, what is the point? Number one. And number two, those are the things that will animate people, that are capable of energizing people. Grief and loss and sadness are not going to, are moral, even though they may appear as the ethically noble sentiments, are not going to energize anybody. And retaining the love of the world and retaining the capacity for joy and for laughter, and welcoming the trickster when the trickster shows up, who's always does something unwelcome. Those are the things that for him, those are the aspects of planetary subjectivity without which we won't succeed in any, without which we won't be able to live this at all. So that's it. Thank you.
Well, thank you so much for this, Mary. It's wonderful to hear you speak on all of these interconnected factors. And I wanted to ask your opinion, your personal opinion on this. So the planet is 4.5 billion years old. And yet our humankind has been on the planet for what, 200,000 years. And yet we are probably the species that has been on the planet the least amount of time of those that had preceded us. And yet we have caused the most damage. So environmentally. So when you were speaking about control and lack of control, I wonder how you view that, because to a certain extent, we have caused permanent damage to this planet in the very little time that we've been, relatively to other species. So I wonder what you think personally about that sense of control, and that in essence, we do have to pivot to these indigenous forms of engaging with our natural world and really opening up to that sense.
Or be guided by these forms of knowing. I think I kind of like what Bourdieu said about this, which is that the world, like the damage that humans have done has made the planet very alive right now. That everything, as Bourdieu says, everything is behaving in response to what humans have done in that space and into their conditions of existence. And so there's this real weird way in which what we see as damage doesn't necessarily have to be, it isn't only damage, right? It's things are, which isn't to say it's all good, it's not good, but damage to our own conditions of living, of our own futures, certainly. But as I say, it's like right now, in the place where I spend my summers on Lake Huron, there's a little bug called the emerald ash borer that is going to kill all the ash trees. And the forests up there are like a third ash trees. I mean, so already the forest, any woodlot or woods looks like a tree cemetery, right? So the ash trees are getting wiped out, but the emerald ash borer is having a field day. And so like everything that gets, so it's very often the case, right, that one life form is getting damaged or displaced because another one has arrived, right? And we call them invasive species, but of course they're not invading, they're just spreading, they're just doing what they're supposed to do as species, right? So that's the other side of it. I don't mean to say we shouldn't talk about damage, but the other side is to see it as this liveliness that has been, these forces that have been mobilized and released, and like, fires hotter than we've ever seen. Hurricanes, for the first time, Acapulco had a Category 4 hurricane for the first time in known history. If you're an ambitious hurricane, now you're having a field day too. So, so I just think it's kind of interesting how complicated that, or how lively that it can seem. And the planet as this geological thing is it's gonna be there, right? It's just we just don't know what's gonna be on it. Non-carbon based life.
Thanks so much for that. I wanted to ask a question about the the turning point, right? The 1999, 2000 turning point, because, and the reason I'm asking this question is I'm interested in the way in which the force poses a question to the temporal break of 1999, in a sense, because we live in a globe as well as a planet, on the globe, in a global environment, as well as with the planet, one might say. And so one way in which I'm sort of trying to think through this is when you're talking about indigeneity and the force of indigeneity, I'm thinking about questions like sovereignty. So sovereignty is in many ways something that is associated with a legal structure of some sort, that begs the question for me of how it is that legal violence, I mean, it's a Benjaminian question, right? Legal violence, mythic violence, and divine violence fit, or force, fit together, or don't fit together. And it seems as if fire, for example, in the way you're describing it, might be in the realm of a divine violence, right? In the sense that it's that it seems like a force, the origin of which is slightly opaque at times, and is destructive. That there may be other forms that are mythic in the sense that they're constitutive of something. So I'm trying to understand the ways in which the force of, say, coloniality rather than colonialism carries with it all these different forms simultaneously, and how we grapple with that in a planetary moment, if you like.
Yeah, that's there's a lot to think about there. I love the question, and I'm not going to have an answer for it. But I think I don't know that we need to do a mapping thing with force, right? I think we have the concept of coloniality. For me personally, I don't feel like that gives me a need to map coloniality and figure out give it a recipe or a character, an analytical description account, as much as to be present to its effects, its actions. And that's why I guess I like the word force. But if I heard you, I may not have heard you correctly, but I was thinking that you were kind of had a idea of doing a mapping with force, and it's not something I would be inclined to do, or I'm not sure what you would get out of doing that.
Use that. Sorry, for Zoom, yes, for everyone. Is how it is that that there is in some ways not a break, right? I mean, that post-colonial,
I see.
yes, that post-coloniality was always post-coloniality, and it was about the beginning of post-colonial. It was about the beginnings of colonialism and what that force brought about. It wasn't necessarily about a post-independence moment, for example. That we still have to grapple with categories that involve us as global subjects, as agents who act as if we could act, right? Even as we are planetary somethings. Is it subjects,
right. Yes,
objects,
yeah.
abjects? I'm not sure.
No, and I mean,
No.
neoliberalism didn't stop. It's so yes, the idea of a pivot isn't to suggest that things stopped and other it is, but it is to suggest that that some new things came into being, and other things began to erode. Yeah, and yes, I would put it that way. And I think if anything, the millennium, in part, it marks a ritual moment, and so I'm using it in that way partly as also, but the suggestion is not there's a cutoff of a bunch of stuff. No. Thank you.
I'll just read one. I think we just have time for one more, one from Zoom.
Okay.
This is from Jessica Doyle. Thank you so much for your talk. In your book, Planetary Longings, you no longer speak of a planetary consciousness, only a longing due to the crisis of knowledge. However, you mentioned briefly about a dangerous subtending ecologic, which precipitates a dystopic scenario while envisioning an utopic one. I was wondering if you could talk about this ecologic a little more, and how do you see this logic currently playing out as a new planetary order?
Wow. Yeah. Could you read it again?
Okay.
Let's all answer this question
Yes.
together.
A good ending one. In your book, Planetary Longings, you no longer speak of a planetary consciousness, only a longing due to the crisis of knowledge. However, you mentioned briefly about a dangerous subtending ecologic, which precipitates a dystopic scenario while envisioning a utopic one. I was wondering if you could talk about this ecologic a little more, and how do you see this logic currently playing out as a new planetary order?
I am sorry, I don't know what the question's referring to. Maybe we can work on it this afternoon.
Sure.
Yeah, sorry.
Yeah, maybe we'll leave it here for us to all. Yeah.
Sorry, yeah.
No problem.
No, that's fine. I think we're sort of out of time anyway, so I don't want to keep people.
Perhaps just one more that's a little more distilled. Gripped by the use of the word force, and I love the use of it here, but I have cringed at the use of it in other contexts, such as business as a force for good or social change as a force for evolution. And I wonder what you make about this.
Oh, that's a great point. Yeah, so what are the cringeworthy uses of force? Yeah, as opposed to like the Star Wars, the force. Yeah, force for good, right? A force for good. That's a very excellent point. And what's funny is it puts us into the mapping exercise that I'm trying to avoid, right? What is a good kind of force and what's a bad kind of force? And I don't mean to say that, that coloniality as a force is good or bad. It just is a thing that it's a thing that operates, right? And business as a force doesn't bother me at all, but business as a force for good is kind of bothersome because it has an ethical assumption on it that we know to be false or hypocritical or problematic. So maybe it's that force for. The force for is the problem. That's where, as far as I can get with it right now, but it's a really nice question. Yeah. Mm-hmm. Yes. Yes. Yes, exactly. Yeah.
Okay, I think we should close here. I want to
Thanks,
thank
everybody.
everyone for being here, and thank especially Mary Louise Pratt for this wonderful presentation.